All right. Alan, do you want me to read the questions? We could go through the.
Yeah, why don't you just start with the questions on your list? So we have a couple questions that came in during the video that we're going to handle first, then we'll get caught up on the new questions that are rolling in too.
Cool. Okay, so the first question I have is from Philip Trudeau. Could this integrate with other text-based languages like Zig, Odin, or JI, or is this a far larger enterprise? And I think the answer to that question is more or less that Dion is not necessarily a language, but it is a base format for languages. It's a new format that many different language constructs could be expressed within. So if we have a language that can be expressed in that way, then we can write tools that work with that language. Our first initial prototypes and everything have been built around a specific language that we prepared, but that's not. We've discovered over time that that's not a limiting factor. We can continue to have more languages, additionally having language plugins, for example, that are themselves written in the language. But I'll stop there. Hopefully that answered the question. You might want to add something, Alan.
Yeah, so I think that I mostly agree with that. I think one of the things that question hints at that we'll probably talk about more in some of the other questions that we've got queued up is the transition path. If you were going to switch to something like this, what do you do with all the existing code? And so that's why you'd care about integrating with existing languages. And so we'll get more into those parts. But I think the key thing that Ryan said there is that at first we were doing all of this stuff coupled, like it's a language, a compiler, an editor all at the same time. And partly from thinking about the value of doing that, and partly from just studying what's possible in the space, we figured out that really all we needed to do all the things we want is a better base format, replace text files, but do everything else in a similar way. So you still build languages on top of the format, you still build editors for the format. It's just not the text file format anymore. That's the key point to answering that idea of integrating with existing languages. It's like, no, not existing languages, but very similar languages on the format, probably.
I just want to say real quick, sorry for interrupting, is that there's a little bit of a weird background noise, and it's probably, I'm seeing it on my live production switcher coming from Ryan's end. I don't think it's too annoying, right? I think people can hear you just fine, but it's just to, so people can be aware that there is a background noise. We know about it. It comes from Ryan's end. It seems to be gone now. Okay, but just in case, just so people know, this is all live. It happens. But we can hear you guys just fine.
Yeah, sorry I guess not in advance anymore, but sorry for my connection issues. But okay, so this next question is from Epsilon, and we decided that Alan was going to be the person who should answer this question. How do we deal with code order? I.e. code order has influence on generated code, which means builds can be non-deterministic. So there's that one.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One, when you're looking at a procedure, like the body of a procedure, there's nothing about the order there that is non-deterministic, because we basically say inside the body of a procedure, it works the same way that C code would. That the series, at least in our language, right? The series of operations that you see determine the order that they're supposed to be interpreted in. There is a specific order. It's not just a soup of things that exist. The format allows you to say the order matters in this section. In fact, the order always matters, and you can just ignore the order when you don't want it to matter, is more the idea. The other part of that is, yes, since we have multiple entry points, there isn't just one build this file and there's a specific order. Instead, what happens is you pick an entry point and it has to collect the program, and we just define the language. Like, our answer is that we define the language in such a way that order isn't allowed to matter there. So yes, it might be that one time you build it, it comes in one order, another time it comes in this order, right? It's flipped around, but the semantics of the language require that those ordering considerations don't have any effect on the results. So it should be fine that we're not actually using the file, but pulling from these dependency trees to build things.
Yeah, cool. So this next one was from Forking Paths about the editor. Could I elaborate on the uniform input system? And yeah, the thing that I meant by uniform input system is more or less that we tried to decouple the controls from specific language constructs as much as possible. The first prototype that we had made was, just hotkeys basically for like certain language constructs, like hit S to make a struct kind of thing. But over time, we wanted to start decoupling that because many of the concerns that people have voiced of having multiple languages and stuff like that, you don't really want the controls to be coupled to the language constructs themselves. So the thing that we have so far, it's kind of a work in progress. There's a lot of stuff in motion, but the thing that we had for this demo is there's something we call like the completion lister, where if you start typing something, a list comes up that shows you possible things to reference or possible language constructs to form. And you can tab through those. It's kind of like tab completion, but with language features too. And it kind of works that way for almost everything. And then there are a few hotkeys that are sort of special case, but they're the simpler ones. So for example, if you hit the plus key in an expression, you're not going to make like the plus character. That's a hotkey for making a plus node in an expression. So that's sort of what I meant by that. And we have like a semi-complete picture for this demo, but obviously it's something we have to consider moving on to the future as well, as we want to decouple the controls from the language as much as possible. It's important to get that decoupling right. So we're sort of getting there, but yeah.
If I may, I'll just say one of the very next things we've decided to work on in the short run is to make a notepad version of Dion, which is just to say a version of an editor for the format that doesn't know anything about the language at all, just so that you have a way that can edit Dion data, like the Dion data files, without the editor assuming anything about the language, right? We think that's the next big thing for us to get right, is that notepad version.
Yeah. Cool. So this next one is from I don't know how to pronounce this, Naum, N-A-U-M, and I think it's about the editor too. Let me read it though. It's kind of a long one. So it wouldn't matter if I use Vim and code in some specific language. Dion will have to support for parsing the abstract syntax tree for that language and abstract the Vim windows, which to me seems too complicated. So I guess it will need some specific editor like ForCoder, and only be possible to parse some specific languages that it has enough information. It's an impressive project. I just feel it seems that we have a strong change to migrate to it. So I don't. Maybe you can clarify a little bit of that. I think maybe there might have been some details that that we maybe missed, but the idea is not that Dion supports all possible like textual language that you're used to using. It's not going to support like all possible editors. The idea is to introduce a new format and tools for that format. So it's not like we're not trying to work with all existing code. We're sort of introducing a new format and set of tools for it. Hopefully that's clear. I maybe misunderstood your question, but I think that's the best I can do. Maybe you can clarify if I misunderstood something. And then this next one is from Andrew Kelly. Does the language have conditional compilation? If Windows does this, if Linux do that, or if Windows do this, if Linux do that? If so, how does that interact with the renaming feature? And that's something Alan is probably best suited to answer.
Yeah. Okay. So the short answer is no. It doesn't have anything like that right now because we didn't build a prototype of what that looks like. But it does have the bones that we need to understand what that would look like. So if you look at the way our entry point thing works, when you pick an entry point and say build this, and then it picks all the dependencies, that right now is something that the only parameter is the entry point. But there's no reason that things like selecting the target operating system or target architecture or anything like that couldn't be parameters to that. I mean, it's a UX problem. We have to decide what it looks like to activate the compiler when you have to specify those things. But besides that, those would just become factors in the discovery process. But a part of what we're doing here is even when you in C code, if you were to put if0 guard around some code and kill it, right? So that code is out, then all the semantic analysis for the stuff on the inside dies. That's something we've rejected. We mentioned it briefly in one of the slides, which is that in our system, even if you no-op some code, it still links up to the things it's supposed to link up to. So things like variable renaming are based on harder links than identifier matching, so that you can do stuff like kill some code but still have the structure inside work correctly in the new format. Yeah.
Cool. And I think I didn't have all of them written down. I think whatever you have that I missed.
Yeah, I have one more. Okay. So the last one that we have from before the video ended, then we'll go catch up on all the new ones, is from the Danch. Why is it sometimes useful to have errors? So within the first section, we talked about how we looked at a couple different error handling strategies, and what we ended up choosing was not to eliminate errors, but to keep them. So there's this is something that we actually could say a lot more on, and so we won't go into the full thing because we might end up making some blog posts or videos to help describe our thought process more. But the short answer is, there's a couple ways you go about trying to eliminate errors. If you eliminate them from the language, you end up in all kinds of problems. You kind of need errors because they give you a constant feedback of what you screwed up. If you work in a language that never can give you an error, you don't get that constant feedback. But there's another more subtle issue, which is that if you don't have errors, then there's no string of bits that forms an invalid program. So if you ever want to add a new feature, you can't, because every string of bits has already been allocated to a defined program. You have no space to grow your language into the places where there used to be undefined programs. So that's one issue. There's another one, which is more to do with the problem of how do you build an editor that never allows you to make errors. And that also, it turns out, as we've been playing with it, if you just go too far down that road, we've eliminated things like braces not matching, but we haven't done that by saying the editor never allows it. We've basically done that by saying we chose a base format that just doesn't have that kind of problem, right? We chose the original data structure to solve the problem, not the editor. Making the editor super complicated by having it constantly do checks if something is allowed and constantly in each context changing what you can even do is a really hard thing for a human to get used to working with. The basic idea that something always works, that your tool always works in a predictable way, can't really be violated. And so it turns out that from various perspectives, you just kind of are way better off if you allow for errors and just have a strategy that contains them, like we're trying. There might be other good ways to do it, but I don't think eliminating them would ever pay off.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have more to say about
Cool.
that one, Ryan. That's something we think about a lot.
Yeah. I don't think I have much to add. You always sum it up better than I ever can. So, so I guess we can go to the questions we missed. I can, if you want, I can just read through them linearly so that one person doesn't have to Cool.
Yeah, you read each one, and if you have a response, go ahead and I'll follow up. That seems like a good way to do it.
Okay. Cool. Okay. So here's the first one that I see. Are the rendering decisions stored in the AST, or is there a different data structure like the slice/view thing? And it kind of depends on which one you're talking about. So when it comes to, for example, syntax decisions, do we render the braces? How far do we indent code? That's all stuff that's just a rendering setting, like an editor sort of setting. When it comes to slices and views, that is actually stored in the code. So you can actually store stable views of things. I only want to see the vector types, for example. That's a structure in the code base. And then the editor just has a capability to say, okay, view this structure as my view for the editor. So that kind of stuff is stored in the AST. Syntax stuff is not. Same with code LOD. That's not stored in the code in any way. We don't have to mutate the code to view it differently in that way. The thing that we don't know a whole picture on yet is, as we had mentioned in the talk, we have many plans to start visualizing code in different sort of organizational structures. For example, tables. And to me, at least, Alan can probably add his thoughts, but it's unclear what degree will store stuff in the code to help make those visualizations work. Really, it kind of depends on how we choose to implement it. You could go different ways, but we haven't implemented that yet, so that's just kind of conjecture. But yeah, that's basically what I have to say about it.
So I don't have too much to add on that. I think the main thing I'd love to point out is kind of what the way we conceptualize the problem that we're facing. So I agree that the way we end up rendering things is spread across these different sources. And I think that the easy way to justify why we're doing that is we don't want to fall in the trap of making something an editor feature when it should be a language feature or a format feature. And same is true for each of the other things, right? So the slice is a format feature. Any language, you could just have this idea that, oh, we have this construct in our language that uses a list of things and renders them. The language just needs to not disallow unstructured lists, and then you have the full idea of slices, right? So it's basically a format feature at that point. But there are other things that, you might say, like, if I want to filter, make a list of, like, view all of the things that are functions that take this parameter or this type as a parameter, that's now a language feature in intermixing with everything else, right? Because you have to know some stuff about the language to do that thing. And then there are things that are just a part of the editor, like the styling of the braces and the indentation, which is mostly just an editor feature, the way it's currently set up. And a part of what we're trying to figure out when we are designing our system is where should each problem be getting solved, right? Should it be getting solved in the format, the language, or the editor? We don't claim to know the best place to put a lot of these things because it's very early on and there's a lot of different ways to sort them out. But that's like, we're finding that it's very easy to make cool features like we tried to demo by just playing with where we put the solution to each problem.
Cool. So here's the next one. Great job on the presentation. Thank you. Is Dion supposed to be a complete ecosystem, or could it be used with arbitrary languages? We kind of answered this already. It's not suitable for arbitrary languages, especially those that only work with like text-based formats, but we're not limiting it to one specific set of language features necessarily. Like we're taking very seriously the idea that not everybody wants to use the same set of language features. Different language features are better for different purposes, and the format should support that, and the tools that we write should support that too. So it's like sort of supposed to be a complete ecosystem in the sense that we're designing a new format and tools for it. But it's also kind of like there's also this other side where there is like this pathway to introducing new kinds of languages, because again, it is just a base format. It's not necessarily a language that's locked in place.
Yeah, and just to add one other thing that we can say about this idea of the ecosystem, that is true of things outside of the language problem too. So the version control problem is one we haven't tried to solve, but I have a hard time personally imagining that it's going to be that big of a hurdle. It's more of a just solve it for this data structure. How do you do diffs on it and stuff? It's not going to be conceptually difficult, because at the end of the day, we can always just fall back to what already works, which is just to say you build a version control system as a separate piece based on this format, right? So if we define a clean format and can build version controls for that format, that's all we really need. Now, there might be reasons to try to integrate it into a tool to get more of the features out, and it might be easier to do that integration with a good format, but we have that fallback of the system that already works, which is define a format, build all the separate tools for it. So it is and isn't trying to be an ecosystem, I guess, is the thing.
Cool. Okay, integrate with current languages. We've already talked about that. Is there a risk that by tightly, this is from Lori.
I think you missed
Did
one.
I skip one?
Yeah, I'll read it real quick.
Oh, sorry.
From Mustafa, do you translate the AST to C, then compile it into executable, or do you compile it directly? Right now, we are translating it into C, but not. So basically, we're just using C as a hacky way to compile. We were more interested in the stuff that we thought were more like unsolved problems. How to compile an abstract syntax tree is something that all kinds of solutions have been already explored, and so it's definitely work that has to be done to build a real version of this product that we could all transfer to someday. But it's not something we need to do to prove out the concept, right? So the back end is just plopping things out to roughly roughly isomorphic C stuff. It's not even trying to be idiomatic, so it's not really readable C code either. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so let me. Okay, so here's the one I was reading before. I don't think there were any others in the middle there. Is there a risk that by tightly coupling so many parts of the system, language, editor, version control, etc., it will make it very difficult for it to gain traction? It feels like to succeed, it will have to compete with so many other tools. And my thoughts on this, that's true, and I think that we've been working towards a picture where things aren't necessarily coupled in the way that you might expect if you're designing an editor for a specific language and rendering for that specific language and everything. That's when you get into that coupling problem, and that's definitely how our first prototypes were. But I think over time we've sort of been moving towards a story where it's kind of just the new base format. It doesn't have to be, and that base format doesn't have to be coupled to the language necessarily, in the same way that text is not coupled to C language semantics. Do you have anything else to add there?
No, not on that one. That seemed pretty good.
Okay, cool. So can you give a glimpse of how a user would define its own language on top of Dion? Alan's probably the best person to talk about this. I'll pass it off to him.
Okay, so first of all, it's a little hard to give you a glimpse because we've only done one, and it's more been of a decoupling. Like, we started with the coupled idea, and we are trying to, over time, do all the decoupling, and we're getting closer and closer all the time to a separate format and language, and that's what we're still doing the research to finalize that first step, and then we'll see if we can design languages on top of it. So everything I say will be speculative, but the way we think it works is something like this. You have, let me do it by comparison to the way you would do it on a text file real quick. So with text files, you define a language by sort of making a spec that says, you know, here's how we're going to interpret these sequences of characters into keywords, and those are going to form these grammatical constructs. And, you know, you just spec out what the inputs mean and how they get translated into programs, right? We think it's basically the same idea. You'll have a spec of what the file format looks like first. And then you'll say, okay, if you're given a file that looks like this, here's the function that maps input Dion files to output executable files. And so you might say things like, okay, we expect to see a root node of this type, and we expect to see, and, you know, the nodes themselves might have, you know, depending on how the design ends up, like 1 to 2 to 3 bytes or 4 bytes of a node, a value that's just the kind of node it is, you know. Who knows, but that's like details, right? You have some kind of room there to decide how many nodes you have. It then says something like, okay, if we see a node with that code on its node, then this is the kind of node it is for our language, and here's how clusters of these nodes and these shapes get translated into programs. It would be a spec just like a text file language spec would be. It just would explain things in terms of the input of Dion formats instead.
Cool. Sorry, I'm just kind of getting a scope of all the questions we have. There's
I can read the next one if you want to keep it going.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
All right, so the next one is from USDA approved. Will we be able to drag little code snippets anywhere on the screen at some point, such that you can have things side by side? That sounds like a Ryan question, so I'll pass it off to you.
Cool. All right. Yeah, we mentioned in the talk that, well, let me start by just saying the existing demo that we prepared kind of tried to appear as text files, so it was just a linear top-to-bottom organization of code. We're considering other high-level organizations as well. So, for example, we mentioned tables. An idea that we've been thinking about also is that kind of canvas idea. I don't know. It's hard for us to answer whether that'll be a thing that we actually like formally do, like as if you're going to have a blueprints editor or something. Not that the format excludes that. It's not necessarily something we're going to have within our UI picture. But you know, there's questions to answer there. But the idea is that the format's not preventing it. The architecture of the system isn't preventing it. So stuff like that is sort of what we're thinking about exploring probably in this upcoming year, largely. So yeah, that's basically what I can say about that. But just we're thinking about the problem. We're interested in the solution to the problem, and we also don't want to view code as just a list all the time. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question. And
all right, I can keep going to read the next one. From Martin Wickman,
cool.
The question is, it seems like saving to a text file or to a text format would solve a lot of problems for version control, diffing, etc. Can you expand on the reasons you choose not to do this? My answer to that is there's actually not a particularly good reason why we don't do it. Obviously, we are designing a new format because we think that's the solution, but there is a goofy little way that we could get around some of these transitional problems by just saying, hey, once we have the data in a sort of close to serializable format, like we have it in the, we have the like the thing we were editing, and we say it's time to serialize that. We could just define that instead to stringize it, right? And it would create a text file, and you could check that into Git. The thing is, then we would have to design the text file to actually be diffable in a useful way, right? So it's not good enough to just say it looks like text, because it'll have to look like, for it to have the features that the Dion format has, it would have to look like text that would not behave like text during changes, right? So a small change in the AST could lead to a massive change in the text. So it's not clear to me that things like merges could be handled properly, or that like the visualization as text files in text editors would be particularly meaningful to humans. And if we did try to do that, then we would have to start trading off some of the features we want. And so we're right back into the game of trading away what's useful to making that cycle as good as possible, just because the old system that we are inheriting has certain limitations that we haven't gotten past. And that's kind of what we're trying not to do. So that's my thoughts on it.
Cool. So I guess the next one is using other languages. Is it possible to convert existing code to one used by Dion? If you use LLVM, for example, as a backend for compilation, then I assume it should not be so hard to generate proper AST tree from compilable code. I think, yeah, we haven't really like come up with like a single story of like how do you take your C code and move it into Dion. Like you could not all the concepts will map properly. Maybe if you do it from a lower level, that makes sense. Or maybe it doesn't. I don't. It's hard for me. It's hard for me to answer. We haven't really talked about the unified story of like how do you move code from Dion to, or from C to Dion. We've talked about the other way around, but I don't know if Alan, you might have better thoughts than I do on that.
I honestly don't think that I can say much more than that. I think the main thing I could say is that what you're basically talking about building is a transpiler from an existing language to Dion format. And there's, I mean, that kind of thing is a hard thing to build, and especially if you want to build it well, right? But there's no thing in principle that I can think of that makes that an unsolved problem, right? We know how we would go about doing it. It's just a matter of like when the time comes that we're trying to really get that to happen, someone has to do the work, right? And so one thing is that this project so far has been a research project. Could we do this transition has been the question, and whether or not we build one of those things that transpiles, it isn't really going to help us answer whether or not we could make use of a transition like this.
Cool. Okay. So because everything is effectively in AST, have you thought about representing different ideas with regards to control flow, which would not be easily expressible in textual-based languages?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So we've kind of been breaking down a lot of things that maybe people take for granted, and things like C or C-like languages, and try to compose things into simpler pieces. And that's partially because we want to drive towards a very easy to implement like core format for a language that's easy to build on top of and easy to implement a backend for, that kind of thing. And so, for example, loops in Dion right now are not like, we don't have for loops really. There's no while loops or anything. We just have a loop construct, and then you can stick other more granular concepts into that. So stuff like a loop condition, initialization, increment step, anything like that. Those are all like separate pieces that you can compose in various ways to produce the same effects that a while loop or a for loop would. And that doesn't mean that our loop construct is the most ergonomic. Like a for loop might be the right choice for a particular problem, but that's kind of more the thing we're thinking should be maybe a part of a library, for example, like a language plugin library system that compiles into the more more basic Lego building block kind of things. So hopefully that gives you a picture. I'm sure Alan will add more here.
Yeah. So another example. So to take everything Ryan said is true, and this is an orthogonal point, which is there are also opportunities to build things that you never could have in text. So that kind of thing, you could build like a hacky version of what we have that would fit into a text file just fine. But another thing we have is, because we don't use identifier matching, but we use links between the referencer and the referencee that are like more direct so that the renaming works. We can do things like having breaks and continues that reference the loops that they break and continue out of. Now, you could do that with identifiers too, It's just that now that is a part of that idea that everything has these links, and instead of having to do identifier matching, but there's also like more you could do. We could go completely outside of the realm of like structured programming if we want and make it more manageable. We could do like a more sort of code block and jump based thing like you'd get out of the thing that comes to my mind whenever I think about that is the Clang LLVM SSA intermediate representation. I believe they have this kind of control flow model. And we could experiment with what an editor looks like and if it's human usable for that. And that's a thing we haven't gotten a chance to do yet, is figure out what's the best thing you could do for control flow human interface if you have a little bit more freedom to design the interface however you want. We don't know. There probably is, but hard to say.
Cool. All right, so is it a decent summary to say that Dion is redefining what code is as a textualization of something much closer to the actual AST as opposed to a new specific language? Instead of a C compiler compiling text files, they compile Dion files. Yeah, I think that's basically the picture. Maybe I don't know what you mean by textualization, because the format is actually just like a binary structure that encodes a tree-like kind of thing. It's different than what you might see in a compiler, but it is kind of like the abstract syntax tree. But with all the things that we've already said being true, it's a little hard to describe. But I think other than that thing, I may have just misunderstood what you mean. That's basically the picture. So it's kind of like a new format for building structures that tend to look like code but can look like many things, and then we're building tools around that. So you can imagine compiler backends compiling various different kinds of languages stored within the Dion format to machine code, for example.
Yep, I don't have anything to add to that. That's right.
Cool. Maybe out of scope for the talk, this is from Andrew Reese. Could you talk a bit about your thoughts on Dion as a protocol file format that would be usable in context and tools made by others, or is Dion expected to always be the base layer application platform? I think our picture is that we're building a tool for it. We're building like all the tools that are needed to at least have a working computing environment, but we've both talked about it before, and we're pretty open to the idea that the format is a format and other people can build tools for the format too. So we don't want to be like the monopoly on the tools necessarily. We're just making a format, also building tools for it, because a format's useless if there aren't tools for it. But in the future, if people want to build their own tools for Dion, for the Dion format, for example, the Canvas editor kind of thing, that's perfectly within the picture of what we think. Yeah.
Yep. I have nothing to add to that one either. We can go to the next one. I'll read this one. So you brought up that Visual Studio falls over when it comes to preprocessor stuff. Did you solve this problem? I don't think I saw any preprocessing. So the answer is yes and no. We didn't solve the problem, and this is a part of like the philosophy of reinventing the wheel that is pretty critical. Sometimes you've gone down a path by making decisions about what tools you're going to include into your system. And that path includes really hard problems. And sometimes solving those problems is necessary, but sometimes taking a step back and unrolling old decisions is the easier way to avoid the problem. Don't solve hard problems if you can get the same result by solving an easy problem. And that's kind of why we didn't do any preprocessing, because what's the point in adding a preprocessor, right? If it doesn't do something good for you and it causes problems, maybe just don't go down that path.
Yeah. Cool. Just moving on to the next one. Any thoughts on live code editing in Dion, since you know exactly which parts of the AST must be recompiled? I think like this is I think we briefly discussed this towards the beginning of the project, and we were sort of like, let's like not go down that road yet, I think, because it kind of gets a little hairy. I think certain things we've discussed are kind of like hot or like live editing. Like, for example, if you have a pure functional like expression tree, you could visualize the results ASAP, possibly. In terms of changing like running structures at runtime of the code, that's probably something I don't know. I don't want to say anything like completely wrong. That's probably like maybe if you're replacing like a function definition at runtime or something, it's probably something you could do. But we haven't really gone down the road of fleshing out the entire story for that. But that being said, for when it comes to knowing which parts of the AST must be recompiled, we have discussed incremental building, for example, which is it's a lot more well-defined within the system. You're not having to like spit out a bunch of files that correspond with the .c files, for example. You can sort of consider, for example, build units by their top level structure, for example. So you can consider like subtrees of code to be the thing that you're doing incremental building on, which are maybe more easy to cache results for. Yeah.
Cool. All right, so the next one says, how would you address security issues such as reverse engineering a project stored in Dion format? Okay, so the story about how source code and binary distributions work would be the same as the way source code works now. So if you are worried about people reverse engineering your thing, you could say the same exact thing about text files, right? If you're distributing with Dion files, then it's the same as distributing .c files today. And if you distribute an executable file, that's the same thing as distributing a C file today. If you're asking if we think that there are more security vulnerabilities, I wouldn't think so. I don't know why there would be. And if you're asking if we can do a better job, like preventing reverse engineering, maybe if it turns out to be easier to program with the system, maybe you can do a better job programming your systems to be opaque. I don't know, but I don't think that it really changes anything in that like axis. I don't know if Ryan thinks the same, but I believe that's.
Yeah, I think that's basically my perception too. So I think I think a risk for this project is Microsoft catching wind of it and employing the team to work on VS Dion. How would you avoid that, assuming you'd want to? Well, I don't have any plans to work for Microsoft, and if they, if so, I don't know. And I'm also not concerned with. Maybe this is like bad to say live on a stream. I'm not that concerned with like Microsoft producing like a good product that competes with what we're doing. So I don't know if Alan wants to add anything there.
Yeah. I think it's hard. So I won't speak for anyone else on the team. The thing I loved about this project, and assuming we're going to keep working on it, so the thing I am going to continue loving about it, I hope, is that it's basically been purely research from the part I've been able to add. It's not there's been so far no pressure to do anything other than just solve problems that weren't solved before, and we haven't finished doing that. So anyone who picks up the ideas we've presented today and starts running with it will still run into unsolved problems, and they'll have to get into the research mindset. And honestly, if people are solving problems that weren't being solved before, I don't really care who's doing it. Like, I just want that knowledge to be out there. And so I'm going to keep working on it.
Yeah,
and
sure.
if other people try to compete,
yep,
and they win, as long as they did a good job. And if they didn't do a good job, then I'll keep doing my thing, right? So
yeah, for sure. I think this is a clarification from a previous question, which was this from Nam. Again, sorry for pronunciation. Main question was about integration with existing text editors. Hopefully I covered that. We're not integrating with text editors. But you're saying we have to totally migrate to Dion tools only, which would be bad for any user. I think it is like there is a problem, like a friction problem, where it's like I'm used to using 4Coder or Vim or VS Code or like whatever people prefer, and that makes me like not want to move to Dion, and that's totally a problem. Our theory is that some of the wins you get from a tool like Dion just become so massive compared to the existing text editor solutions that hopefully it's worth it. And the benefits of the format sort of hopefully will speak for themselves. I think that's at least our theory, and we think that that's better than maybe hamstringing the features that we can accomplish by trying to like work with every existing thing that works on a completely different code format, for example. Yeah. Do you have anything else to add there?
No. Yeah, I do not.
Cool. Okay. How do you think you will handle all the money and fame that is bound to come because of this project? Well, if that happens, I'll probably use it to keep working on Dion. So
Yeah, yeah. I believe Ryan and I actually discussed this before we really got much progress started, which is as soon as it's possible, him and I will retire to an island somewhere and do game jams for the rest of our life. But I don't think
yeah,
it's reached that level yet.
yeah. um, okay, not sure if this was asked. Can the types be propagated through the AST?
Do you want me to handle that? I think I
Yeah,
know what they're
I don't
getting at.
understand it. So
So type info is not encoded in the AST, and this is a part of that idea of allowing errors. And we didn't really get to discuss it in this talk, but it's an idea that we wanted to fit in, and there's just too many of our ideas to fit into this talk so far. Like I said, we might do more to discuss some of our other ideas later. But there's this issue of how much structure you choose to put into your format, right? And so a text file you could think of as completely unstructured. It's got the only thing it is an array of bytes. And then it's a very far end of the other end of the spectrum. You could imagine a fully type-checked program that is semantically correct and type checks, and it is about ready to go and get compiled. And that's like the most structure we put into something ever. And it turns out that being at either end of the extreme there has downsides. The downside of the unstructured stuff is that you don't know what's going on, but the downside of the highly structured thing is that the editing is too complicated to maintain. You can't, as a human, understand the consequences of each interaction you do when the context is so complicated. So picking a spot in the middle somewhere where there's structure when it helps and lack of structure when looseness helps one of the problems, whether that's the editor or the compiler or the human understand what's going on, is important. So there is no type info in the format. We derive the type info from the format using very simple functions, though, because once you have the abstract syntax tree, and if you keep the type system simple, typing a single expression or a single type expression is really easy. It's really easy to just construct something that describes that type. So what generally happens is stuff like you know what thing you're looking at in the abstract syntax tree, and then you ask, what type does that thing have? And then you can work on that type and throw it away when you're done. Or, we build a caching layer or something later on that keeps those answers up to date or something. Hopefully that answers the question. It's a little unclear if that answers the question, but I think so.
Cool. So this is from Terry's Python. One issue I have with a lot of existing IDEs and editors is that a lot of the helper information, such as highlighting complete suggestions, is that for larger complicated code bases, especially with include stuff in C, is that the systems that provide these often don't work or are slow, that you have to wait a long time for it to enable because it's being computed in the background. It seems with Dion, most of these issues will be non-existent, as most of the information needed to support these features are stored in the encoding of the source. Would you say that is a fair observation of some things Dion can provide? I would say yes, for sure. I think we'd both say yes. The idea is really moving closer to the structured information that a lot of these higher level kind of more smart features need. There was that diagram in the presentation where like everybody's starting from here and they're trying to get to is my mirror flipped? Yeah, okay. So they're starting here, trying to get here, and they're all working hard to get to supporting these like smarter features. The idea is that we're moving it closer so that it's a much less effort to, for example, like Alan just mentioned, get to the type information, which is much easier to compute given the structure. Whereas if you're asked to get the type information from a C code base and you just handed a bunch of C files, it's insurmountable. Like you have to start writing a lot of crazy stuff. And C doesn't make that easier because it doesn't specify projects, and like there's tons of other problems that come in specifically because of C. But a lot of the problems stay regardless of the textual language that you choose.
Okay, cool. I have nothing to add to that one, so I'll read the next one. Okay, this is, I think, specifically to me. You replied to me and someone else saying code-based scalability is something you think you can solve. Can you elaborate more? Curious on your thoughts with doing things like rename transformations or struct member additions, deletions across millions of lines. Okay, so yeah, I had a couple of questions that I answered during the video while the video was playing in the chat about what do we think we could do with larger code bases, and can we actually, like, have we tested them, and how does that work? And that's something we struggled with a lot early on, like trying to figure out the right way to define like the links between things. What we kind of ended up at is that it probably, first of all, doesn't matter a whole lot. The main thing is like the files, in terms of, if you take the editor portion of the problem out for just a second and think about the sort of the idea of module or code files and how you save and move code files around, we at first were playing with other ideas, like having one giant mega file that just describes everything in your program, and at the other end of the extreme, having like a great big mega folder that has one file for each top level global thing, right? And ultimately, we kind of converged on like, hey, the way C did it is kind of good enough. Like, you have files that describe things. Maybe our file size is maybe a little bigger because we think of it more like a library fits inside of a single file, rather than like one sort of sub portion of a library where a collection of 10 or 20 or 100 or 1,000 flat files make up a library. We kind of think of it as a little bit higher granularity than that. But for the most part, you could write your code the same way you do in C anyway, in our theory, right? Which is just you have like a collection of structs and related functions, and that goes into one file if you wanted to do it that way. Now, for the editor part, there are things that stop working if stuff isn't loaded in. But this is kind of like that idea that our theory is that we get to an idea of something like the notepad of Dion, which is where there is no language smartness at all, and just get that thing working even in the absence of any smartness, right? That way, there's never such a thing as a situation where you couldn't fall back to something that is dumb and correct broken pieces. There are problems like if you change the location of something, right? So if I have a node in my file and I'm linked directly to it by like an index or a pointer, and then I change its location, but something that was referencing that thing was not loaded in, then it won't know about that change in location. But the answer is, don't make that your data structure, right? We haven't fully solved that one because that's actually how our system works. That breaks right now, but we have a new data structure we're switching to try out not breaking in that way. In general, though, it's like whatever data structure you pick will determine what things do and don't break during what kind of edits you choose to do. And we're still zooming in on the exact right data structure that we think we want to work with.
Okay, sorry for interrupting. We do have time for, I want to say, a couple of more questions. I know you're drowning in them, but hopefully once the Q&A is done, you can both stay in the chat for a little while longer, right? But just for the official purposes, a couple of more minutes, a couple of more questions, sorry, and then you guys can rest your voices.
Yeah, I think I see like there's like a little arrow in the bottom right hand corner of the matrix, and it's got a red number showing me how many times I've been pinged, and it keeps going up. It's like at 150 now or something. So it's
yeah, we're not catching
a little
up.
crazy,
we're
but
not catching up. All right.
Yep.
All right.
So this next one is given that you're storing an AST and have sets, you could theoretically give a visual graph representation like blueprints, as well as visualizing it like text. Are those things you're interested in? People learn and understand different ways. I was also wondering if you could make a set from the scope function you're in and show it to the side of the scope and function you're. I see. And show it to the side of the scope and function you're in. Lots of fun visualizations that may be more powerful with a non-traditional text editor. Yeah, so I think I'm totally interested in that. As we kind of mentioned a little bit before, we don't necessarily want to say that we know the perfect user interface representation ever possible, period, for code. So if people want to have wild different editors that maybe do things a lot better than what we could maybe do, they're obviously they can do that because it's just a format and they can build an editor for the format. The thing that we'll do might not be there's no specific set that we've settled on so far, but the idea is to not prevent those sets from existing, but we might settle on something more constrained for the tools that we build, just to not try to solve too many problems at once.
Yep. I'd also like to point out that one thing we haven't explored a lot of that is totally valuable and pretty low-hanging fruit in a system like what we've already got is that sort of idea of like if you have a function, you're looking at all of the things it references and pulling them into a set to visualize just all the relevant local things. We haven't really done any of that. We can only hand build our sets so far, but we think that just being able to have implicit sets of all kinds of operations is going to be super. That's going to have a lot of implications that we haven't got a chance to check out yet.
Yeah. So next one, how do you see Dion working with metaprogramming? Generating code as a string seems to not make sense, so only generating AST constructs directly seems to be available. I guess I'm pretty encouraged by this because we haven't worked out necessarily all the pictures when it comes to, let's say, like building a project and having metaprogramming as a core piece of that. Like there are some unanswered questions there. Like how do you reference something that's going to be generated but isn't yet? Like there are some things that we kind of want to be able to figure out there. But in terms of like generating abstract syntax trees and everything within a system like this, it seems easier to start considering kind of like the Lisp style thing of like, hey, here's a literal, but it's a literal that's just the abstract syntax tree representation of the code that it is. You could probably work to a much better point for generating code that way, and obviously analyzing code, like getting information out of code that wasn't provided by any default compiler tools that you're using. That's also just a lot easier because, again, you're working within the structured environment, so you don't need to like write a parser to figure out stuff from your C code. It's just like the stuff that you care about is there, or it's very easy to get to relatively. So analyzing is a lot easier. Generating, I think, should be easier. But yeah, again, there are still some questions that we've got to answer there.
I would say that I think that this is basically, I think that we will find that it is way better when we're done. We haven't gotten to study it yet, but my feeling on it is actually that generating strings for metaprogramming is actually not very good. It's what we have to do, but I think you could imagine, as long as you have an API that can sort of stream out or construct the things you're trying to construct, that you can construct that thing, right? So it's like in the process of building metaprogramming, half the problem is the gen part. And to do the gen, we just need a good API that constructs Dion nodes, not something else. There's nothing crazier to it than that. And I think that'll be way better than printfing code. I want to jump back to actually accidentally skipped one. I don't know why Matrix doesn't highlight all of them, but there's one here. It says, how many hours of work was put into this project to get to the current state? I don't actually know. I know how many we started it in March, so it's been what, like 8 or 9 months? 8.
I think it's been like 8 months and a week or something like that.
And that's like side project time, so you can imagine like maybe 10 hours a week from both of us, plus a little bit from our third member who joined later.
Yeah, I think because like Alan works full time. I was doing I was working full time for part of it, and then I'm in school also, so it's all side project just for us. So I don't know. Do the arithmetic to figure out how many hours that might be.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Again, sorry for interrupting. I think we can do a pause here. We can continue in the chat. And I just want to say to people, before they start yelling at Abner for stopping things, or if you go to Handmade Seattle, again, right, handmadeseattle.com, there's a media page. That media page is so important because that's where all the polished stuff is going to go up. All the extra content that you couldn't see is going to go up there. Of course, it's going to take a little time, but just join the newsletter, and we'll keep you appraised. Okay. So I just want to thank Alan and Ryan for just taking this impromptu Q&A live like that. I hope you enjoyed yourself and that your voices are okay. I hope it was fun.
Yeah, it was really fun. And obviously, thanks Abner for inviting us. It's been so awesome.